Although the federal government's war on organized crime was looming, it hadn't yet reached its full intensity. Sensationalists like Walter Winchell had long reported on the mob's activities, but for the most part, organized crime was portrayed as isolated incidents in major cities. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover downplayed the existence of a national crime syndicate, focusing instead on the communist threat. But Harry Anslinger of the Narcotics Bureau had been pushing the national syndicate theory for years and found his champion in Senator Estes Kefauver from Tennessee. The Kefauver Committee, formed in January 1950, aimed to investigate interstate gambling and racketeering, eventually homing in on the mob's influence over the gaming industry. The hearings began in Chicago and quickly spread to other major cities like St. Louis, San Francisco, New Orleans, and Tampa. Kefauver, a plain-spoken politician with a knack for dramatics, turned the hearings into a crusade against organized crime. He and his mostly Protestant colleagues subpoenaed Italian-American, Irish, and Jewish mobsters, making for explosive testimonies. Among the most shocking sessions were those held in South Florida, where the mob's ties to Cuba came under the spotlight, further exposing the far-reaching power of figures like Lansky. The mob's influence in Havana, Las Vegas, and across America was undeniable, and Lansky, ever the strategist, continued to shape the underworld as he worked both sides of the law, cementing his legacy as one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. The first strike against organized crime was landed by Theodore Link, a staff correspondent of the Post-Dispatch, on January 3, 1950. His article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper boldly targeted the underworld. The article prominently featured the faces of two notorious mob bosses, Frank Costello and Tony Accardo, heads of the New York and Chicago outfits, respectively. The piece was not subtle. It directly took aim at their sprawling criminal enterprises, focusing on how they had intertwined themselves with both local politics and legitimate businesses. The headline blared, "Crime Capital Miami Beach Ready to Reopen Gambling Under Costello," signaling the deep connections between mobsters, politicians, and the clandestine underworld. This was a stark revelation of how Miami, a hotbed for organized crime, was once again on the verge of falling under mob control, with Costello at the helm. It detailed the pervasive influence these crime syndicates wielded, not just in illegal gambling, but in politics, business, and everyday life. The article's exposure of these relationships marked the first significant public salvo in what would become a full-scale war on organized crime in America. Miami Beach, this famous resort city, now also the crime capital of the United States and a haven for hoodlums from all over the country, is getting ready to reopen its multi-million-dollar gambling industry with a new boss in control. Frank Costello, Prime Minister of the Underworld, as an investigation by the Post-Dispatch has revealed. Costello's emissary, Meyer Lansky, a New York gambler and boss of gambling in Broward County, just north of here, settled a bitter struggle between two crime syndicates that were contesting for control of the rich gambling industry here. For the first time in a dozen years, however, the gamblers are not sure of full cooperation from public officials in Dade County and the two principal cities, Miami and Miami Beach. For that reason, handbooks in the beach hotels and gambling casinos throughout the county have not all reopened fully, even as the tourist season is about to enter its peak period. Police and law enforcement officers have been interested spectators in the struggle among the gambling syndicates for control of Miami Beach. It is estimated that the payoff to police and public officials in Miami Beach from the syndicates is about $1 million a year. Across the bay in Miami, Vice Squad members used to collect $720,000 a year, which they divided with politicians. The public official apparently most responsible for the continuing delay in the reopening of gambling is Miami Beach City Councilman Melvin J. Richard, who was elected last June. Since his election, gambling on the beach has been shut down more often than it has been open. Richard, a 37-year-old lawyer and Navy veteran, said after he took office, "More notorious national criminals live in Miami Beach than in any other city of this size in the United States. The criminal scum of the country is attracted here. Wide-open Miami Beach existed only by the approval of public officials. It is inconceivable that this could have been the case without money changing hands." High stakes were involved in the competition between the powerful national syndicates for control of gambling, horse race betting, the numbers racket, and other enterprises. Miami Beach is regarded as the richest single plum in the world for horse race betting, with a total of $50 million bet in a single year from handbooks in the hotels and other bookshops. Besides horse race wagering, casinos in Dade County normally offer chuck-a-luck, dice, poker, and other games. Costello's representative, Lansky, brought about peace between the S&G Syndicate and the Little Syndicate here by ruling that the Costello New York group would take a 30% cut from the earnings of both syndicates. The Costello group had already placed one of its men in the Little Syndicate, while the Chicago Capone gang had inserted one of its henchmen in the S&G Syndicate. With Costello taking 30% of the total earnings from the gambling industry here, it is not clear yet how the remaining 70% will be divided among the local syndicates, S&G, and the Little Syndicate, and the Chicago Capone gang. The peace program was worked out by Lansky at a series of meetings in New York City, various locations in Florida, and in Los Angeles. The settlement illustrates the nationwide character of the gambling business, which rakes in $2 billion a year from slot machines alone throughout the country. At one stage in the Miami Beach negotiations, the New York gang wanted 50% of the gambling take here, and the Chicago Capone gang also wanted 50%, which would have left nothing for the local gamblers. They would have been absorbed into the bigger groups. The plan was then modified to give the Costello outfit 30%. Apparently, the settlement now makes the Costello group top dog here, with a significant concession to the Chicago Capone group, all at the expense of S&G. When S&G held full control of Miami Beach gambling, the syndicate was said to have collected between $6 million and $10 million a year from its operations. Members of the syndicate have large holdings of valuable property, including lavish homes on the Gold Coast, formerly known as Millionaire's Row. One of the principal figures in S&G is a former St. Louisan, Julie Levitt. Most of the gamblers and about 250 handbook operators became members of the S&G syndicate in the last 10 years. About 100 gamblers remain independent or are members of the Little Syndicate. The comfortable position of the S&G syndicate, controlling the gambling business with only the Little Syndicate as a competitor, was disrupted last spring. The racing wire service to the handbooks, which provides news of racing entries and results from all tracks in the country, was abruptly shut off for 8 days. This shutdown was attributed to the anger of the Chicago Capone Syndicate, which controls the nationwide racing news distribution, and sought to break into the rich Miami Beach market by acquiring control over handbooks. Bookmakers complained that the Chicago gang could have doubled the price for the racing news service and made a significant profit without even controlling the handbooks. Instead, the Capone Syndicate wanted full control of the bookshops. Shortly after the 8-day shutdown ended, during which the S&G Syndicate improvised by obtaining racing news from an independent bookmaker in Georgia, a new partner appeared in the S&G setup. He is Harry Russell, one of the Russell brothers who operate the Silver Dollar Bar in the Chicago Loop, alongside Tony Accardo, alias Joe Batters, a top Capone hoodlum. Then Benny Kay, a New Jersey gambler, suddenly became a partner in the Little Syndicate. The New York Costello mob inserted Kay into the Miami Beach picture to protect their interests here. Kay, also known as Kay, and originally known as Benny Karpf, has been operating here for about 2 years. He started as the operator of a handbook at Club Collins. Then he organized baseball and football betting on a large scale. His activities extended to New York, where he had connections with a layoff betting establishment at 95 Broad Street. That place was raided on October 20th, but Kay was not there. With Kay of New York and Russell of Chicago in the picture, both local syndicates headed for a showdown. Some gambling establishments reopened, but quickly shut down again. Finally, shrewd Lansky entered the picture and brought peace between the warring factions. However, the cooperation of Miami Beach and Miami officials still restrains the gambling industry from fully opening. Discussing Dade County as a whole, a grand jury recently reported that the county was a capital of crime, adding that the rackets are beyond the scope of local law enforcement agencies. The grand jury suggested another jury inquire into the manner in which some Miami policemen live in or purchase property beyond what their earnings would appear to allow. The jury scolded the Miami police for bickering and feuds, declaring, "This shows the department is not functioning as a team, but rather for the personal aggrandizement or enrichment of certain of its members." Criminals from other cities first vacation here, then they buy property, then they bring in henchmen, and soon they have an organization that can control elections, as in Kansas City and St. Paul. Daniel Sullivan, hard-hitting director of the Crime Commission of Greater Miami, told the Post-Dispatch recently. In radio broadcasts over a Florida network of 14 stations, the Crime Commission asserts, "The risk of jail in the Miami area is light," adding, "A hands-off policy means that the whole criminal element will grow more and more daily. South Florida will be in the headlines as a nest for hoodlums, racketeers, and gangsters." There are two factors responsible for the trouble. The police don't care about going on record on law enforcement, and known hoodlums are coming and attracting lesser lights from their hometowns. The blame lies more with the elected officials here than with the police. Regardless of who is to blame, gangsters and racketeers from all the principal cities of the United States have settled here, spend part of their time here, or have interests in businesses or rackets in the Miami area. When the late Al Capone bought a pretentious villa on Palm Island in the early 1930s, Miami Beach authorities initially resisted the inroads of other gangsters. But Capone won a long legal fight against being evicted from Florida, successfully alleging that the only charge against him was vagrancy. His widow and son still maintain the villa here. Since Capone's arrival, there has been a steady influx of criminals and their associates, both retired and active. Disclosures of their records by the newspapers and by the Crime Commission bring complaints from some citizens who insist that 20-year-old skeletons should not be exhumed. When a man pays his penalty to society, the defenders say, he should be left alone. However, a little probing usually reveals that while the retired criminals may have lost their interest in machine guns, pistols and bombs as they grew older, they have retained just a bit of interest in the numbers racket, a small handbook, or a gambling casino as they bask quietly in the sun here. For example, Jules Beeman, described by the Crime Commission as a pistol-packing top-drawer member of the underworld here, moved to Miami Beach from New York 3 years ago. His arrests in New York, dating back to 1922, ranged from vagrancy to homicide. He was known variously as Julius Kramer, Julius Steele, Harry Kramer, and Jules Berman. Last March, Beeman was investigated by federal authorities in connection with narcotic sales. He also has an interest in a gambling establishment. In 1943, while he was looking into his New York interests, he was shot but recovered. The Miami Crime Commission calls him a public rat who has no business in this community. Samuel Tarrant of Miami Beach, who owns a palatial home on Allison Island, is the head of the Tarrant Distributing Company, which sells television sets and jukeboxes. Before that, he was Sammy Tarrant of the hectic Prohibition days in Minneapolis and St. Paul. He came here in 1945 after he was released from prison, having served a sentence for liquor black marketing in Minnesota. Tarrant was wounded in a hijacking fight in St. Paul in 1925 and later received a 10-year prison term on a grand larceny charge. In 1942, he applied for citizenship but was turned down. His record also includes a Chicago indictment growing out of a stolen bond deal and arrests for investigation on bank robbery charges in Nebraska and Kansas. When he came here, he held a franchise for the distribution of jukeboxes in Florida and Cuba. Harry Stone, a former member of the Purple Gang in Detroit, and Mo Rockwell of Chicago and Detroit own and operate a Miami Beach nightclub that is known as a hoodlum hangout. Among the frequent patrons are Paul Labriola and Martin the Ox, notorious Chicago gangsters. Stone is also known as Sosnick, and his partner Rockwell calls himself Rockfeld, demonstrating that one never knows his neighbor's real name here. The Wofford Hotel on the beach became a hoodlum gathering place after Little Augie Pisano, alias Anthony Carfano, became financially interested in it. Little Augie is a Brooklyn thug with a long police record. His associate in the hotel is John Angasola, who also calls himself King, and who came from Cleveland. Among their friends who come to the hotel for their vacations are Marco Reginelli of Camden and Sam and Joe DiCarlo, racketeers from Buffalo. The S&G Syndicate, now affiliated with the Chicago Capone mob, doesn't like outsiders, but sprang to the defense of Morris Cooper, a nationally known St. Louis betting commissioner, when he was arrested in Miami Beach last July. The charge was gambling. Former Detective Pat Perdue, head of the one-man Miami Beach gambling squad at the time, made the arrest. Brought into court, Cooper was represented by the S&G Syndicate's lawyer, Ben Cohen. The case was dismissed. Perdue is now pounding a beat in the northern reaches of the beach, not because he arrested Morris Cooper, but because of a change in the gambling situation and in the attitude of some city councilmen. Until his shift, Perdue used to make sporadic raids on specific bookies. Cooper, incidentally, is reputed to be one of the 5 biggest baseball and football betting commissioners in the country. The odds set by his statistician Isidore Silverman, formerly of Indianapolis, are said to be used by many gamblers. Silverman now lives on an island in Biscayne Bay and busies himself solely with setting odds, not with actual gambling. Attorney Cohen told the writer that Cooper's arrest was a mistake. Cohen said Cooper wandered idly into a friend's handbook and had picked up the tape on a baseball ticker to learn the ball scores when he was arrested. However, other well-informed Miamians told the reporter that the arrest was engineered by the S&G Syndicate to worry Cooper and possibly prevent him from starting any large-scale operations on the beach. He maintains a home there at 4410 Sheridan Avenue. Cohen was employed to represent Cooper, the informant said, because Cooper is personally popular with many gamblers. In October 1948, Miami Beach police gave another demonstration of their strong feelings against any disturbance of the tranquility of their resort by outsiders, unless the outsiders are fully sponsored by local figures or are retired from the rackets. After several days of surveillance, Angelo Lodato, Springfield, Illinois gangster, his stepfather, Vincent Moncado of St. Louis, Sam Guccione of St. Louis, and 2 young women were arrested at the McAlpin Hotel. 2 other St. Louisianas, who had been with the group when they registered earlier at the Grand Hotel, a center of gangland activity, had disappeared by the time the arrests were made. Lodato, Moncado, and Guccione protested that they were simple tourists. However, 2 fully loaded revolvers were found in their Ocean Boulevard hotel. The women, a Detroit dancer and a St. Louis waitress, said they had been nightclubbing with the tourists. Lodato, an ex-convict who served 3 years in prison on a white slavery conviction, was questioned in the killing of Leonard Giordano, a dice dealer in Springfield, Illinois, in 1948. Moncado is the father of Sam and James Moncado, who were shot to death in separate affrays in St. Louis, also in 1948. Guccione's father was killed in St. Louis more than 20 years ago. Vagrancy charges against the group were dismissed on their promise to leave Miami Beach. Lodato's new Packard convertible was returned to him, and they departed. The newest partner in the S&G syndicate, Harry Russell, the Capone representative in the group, also has an interesting background. Besides being an associate in Chicago of Tony Accardo, Russell was one of 7 men charged in 1941 with stealing $910,000 from funds belonging to Local 1248 of the Retail Clerks International Protective Association. The state's attorney's office in Chicago charged that Russell and Pat Mano, alias Patrick Manning of Miami Beach, Max Caldwell, Rocco DeStefano, Peter Tremont, Milton Schwartz, and Maurice Margolis dipped into the Union Treasury. They allegedly transferred their activities to South Florida. They are known here as patrons of the Wofford Hotel on the beach. The Chicago charge has never been pressed. Adding to the recent woes of the S&G syndicate were the blasts by Mrs. Genevieve Bonamy, the atomic blonde bookie of Miami Beach. The former San Francisco nightclub singer and wife of a horse racing handicapper, Mrs. Bonamy, proclaimed she was angry at the syndicate because it owed her $1,066 and refused to pay. She told Sullivan of the Crime Commission and newspaper reporters that each bookie paid $60 a week for racing wire service and $40 for juice protection. She charged that the syndicate and the thieving hotel keepers who steal everything they can from the bookies were responsible for the troubles in the gambling business. She made it clear that her beef, as she called it, was against the syndicate and the hotels, but not against the bookies. Some hotel owners, she declared, put up a front of respectability, but they are really in league with the syndicate and are bigger swindlers than the syndicate. After exploding her bombshell, she folded her tent and quietly stole away. The amazing police department of Miami is split by feuds, charges of graft, fistfights, and phone tapping, an inquiry by the Post-Dispatch has revealed. Despite civil service protections, the police department here, like the one in Miami Beach, is riddled with politics. The reason is that the safety director, who heads the police department, is answerable to the city commission and can be fired by that body. Civil service only prevents the firing of police officers. It does not prevent the manipulation of the force for political purposes. A high-ranking officer on the force told the reporter that when gambling was in full bloom here, the payoff to police, in control of the situation, was $60,000 a month. A significant part of the payoff, however, was passed through police hands to politicians who had the power to break up gambling but preferred to take the money, the informant said. As in Miami Beach, Miami police take pride in a city without gang shootings. The only murder possibly resulting from gambling or political corruption was that of a black man, said to have been a Batman, or collector, in the numbers racket for a high-ranking officer of the Miami police force. The Batman was killed in April 1948, and the murder remains unsolved. The police force is split into factions and cliques within the factions. The officers must contend with groups of gamblers who are as restless as the waves of the ocean, constantly striving for an in with influential officers. Miami has 6 groups of gamblers who operate when permitted or conduct sneak gambling when the grand jury is in session or when restrictions are enforced. A campaign against bookmakers by Governor Fuller Warren in the past year has caused such turmoil in gambling circles that they don't know where they stand at the moment. The long smouldering feud within the police department erupted last April. Detective Lieutenant C.O. Hutto, the stormy petrel of the force, was badly beaten by Chief of Detectives James O. Barker and a former patrolman W. W. Davenport when they found him in a woman's apartment. Hutto has been an important figure in Miami's police gambling political circles for 15 years. In fact, he was one of the most powerful people in Miami for years. During his stormy career, he has been reduced or suspended 4 times. For 8 years, he headed the vice squad, giving him iron-handed control over gamblers and prostitutes. Lieutenant Hutto charged that the beating he received was the result of a setup. However, he was suspended by Chief of Police Walter Headley. Hutto said he had been interviewing the woman about a murder case when the Chief of Detectives and the former patrolman broke in. Chief Barker responded that he had information that Hutto had been running around with the woman in a city-owned automobile. Barker said he went to the apartment carrying a camera after getting a tip from Davenport. Lieutenant Hutto smashed the camera. In the fight that followed, Hutto suffered a broken nose, cuts, and 2 black eyes. Barker and Davenport were unhurt. Barker took full responsibility for the beating and said Davenport merely restrained the woman. It later emerged that the woman was Mrs. Drew Phillips, wife of a former policeman who was being held on a murder charge in Dublin, Georgia. The apartment had been rented by Lieutenant Hutto, who told the landlord he was the woman's uncle. Georgia police said Hutto had not been asked to work on the murder investigation. Davenport had been discharged from the Miami force in July 1947 on 7 charges of conduct unbecoming an officer. He blamed Lieutenant Hutto for his discharge and said he had been framed. Hutto, who lives in a substantial home equipped with a swimming pool, was found guilty of 2 charges of misconduct and fined a month's pay. His lawyer, Vincent C. Giblin, argued that Hutto's refusal to accept graft led to the fight. Giblin claimed that a number of Miami policemen had been taking graft from gamblers, and Hutto's refusal to participate angered the other officers. One police faction accused the other of tapping Hutto's phone to learn whether he was providing information to newspapers and public officials about payoffs from gamblers to policemen. Both Miami daily newspapers have been fighting crime and corruption in the area, but they have faced nearly insurmountable odds until the past year, when the war between the syndicates and the election of a few honest politicians gave them an opening. Wilson McGee, chief crime reporter for the Miami Herald, led the way with a revealing series of articles on gambling and related activities. The Miami Daily News also ran several series of articles by its 2 chief crime reporters, Don Pettit and Milton Sosin. The Daily News's anti-gambling campaign angered the police so much that detectives filed a $1 million libel suit against the newspaper. Pettit would find a handbook and then write an illustrated news account about the establishment. The picture would be captioned, "For the information of detectives." Next to the photograph would be a detailed description of the handbook. A typical story read, "Another horse bookmakers who are so hard for Miami police to find operates from a 3rd-floor room in the Greentree Hotel at 110 Northeast 2nd Avenue. The bookie answers to the name Bill, and his telephone number is 21171. The book is one of a string of Marty Richmonds. The hotel is in District 1, the territory of Detective Lieutenant John Horace, Flashlight Bill Williams. Under Williams in that district are Sergeant Joel McNeil and Detectives R.B. Simpson, T.I. Elder, G.D. Foss, H.W. Fonts, C.M. Ingle, R.B. Einig, F.L. Love, A.B. Rossman, Al Wiggins, and J.H. King. If the handbook weren't raided or closed voluntarily, the Daily News would run another photograph of the same building with the added query, "What keeps this place open?" As a result of the fight with Lieutenant Hutto, Chief of Detectives Barker was briefly suspended and then demoted to head of the Identification Bureau. He was replaced as Chief of Detectives by Captain Howard. Followers of the Barker faction consider him a martyr. They explained that they wanted to break the power of Hutto, who was so strongly entrenched in city politics and the police department. Barker's followers feel the explosion resulting from the Barker-Hutto fight achieved their purpose, and that Hutto has now been discredited. Hutto told this writer he had refused to enter the ring of officers taking graft from gamblers, and the apartment fight was the result. He said he persuaded 8 Miami area gamblers to file affidavits about graft payoffs to Miami policemen in 1947. Former FBI agents corroborated the statements in the affidavits, he said, but the gamblers later retracted their statements, claiming they made the charges under Hutto's threat to force them to stop operating. In Dade County proper, Sheriff Jimmy, Smiling Jim Sullivan, a former Miami traffic patrolman and ex-prize fighter, concedes that there is gambling. Here we are right in the midst of all sorts of legalized gambling, from the racehorse and dog tracks to the stock market houses, he mused. There was gambling here before I came into office, and there will be gambling after I leave. I was not elected on an anti-gambling platform. This is vacation land, and we have to be tolerant to some degree. I will and do act on any and all complaints made to my office. Why? Last year, my office made 350 gambling arrests, and each of those gamblers paid a fine of between $400 and $500. That is some revenue for the county, isn't it? The leading gambler of Miami is Raymond Craig, who operates a real estate business and several other enterprises on the side. Craig, considered a native son, operates the Bahama and Turf Clubs and some 24 other establishments. Charles Thomas, a former coal miner in Williamson County, Illinois, is another leading gambler. He is a brother of Ora Thomas, a deputy sheriff in Williamson County, who shot it out with Ku Klux Klan leader S. Glenn Young in Herrin, Illinois, back in 1925. Young, Thomas, and 2 others were killed. Charles Thomas's chief partner in the gambling rackets here is Earl Yarborough. They were part of a group of Miamians who ran the Royal Palm gambling establishment until World War II began, when they were edged out by New York gangsters. Thomas now has an interest in the numbers racket and in Club 86, a long, low, orchid-colored building at 86th Street and Biscayne Boulevard in El Portal. He also has interests in Broward County gambling. Craig and Thomas were among the South Florida gamblers who sought to get gambling legalized at the September session of the last legislature. The proposal failed. It was reported that $60,000 was spent by the gamblers in their unsuccessful campaign. Neither Craig nor Tomas participates in Miami Beach gambling. All the Miami gamblers seem to stick to their own territory. About 150 handbooks now operate here on a sneak basis, although they are more open than those in St. Louis. The third article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch expose, published on January 5, 1950, sent tremors through the organized crime world. While the series had already unsettled mobsters by exposing their ties to politicians and power brokers, this particular piece delivered a bombshell that would change the game forever. It announced the beginning of a Senate probe into organized crime, led by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. This investigation would go on to become a historic confrontation between the U.S. government and the underworld, signaling the end of the Mafia's unchecked dominance in America. The article revealed that Kefauver was spearheading a resolution to investigate the sprawling network of organized crime, including the Mafia's infiltration into gambling, narcotics trafficking, and even municipal governments. While J. Edgar Hoover had long denied the existence of a national crime syndicate, the Kefauver Committee would dismantle that illusion. With the headline, Kefauver seeks Senate inquiry on rackets in the United States, national crime syndicates menacing independence of municipal government. The article sent a chilling message to mobsters from coast to coast. This wasn't just about taking down street-level criminals. It was about tearing apart the very infrastructure that allowed these syndicates to thrive in the shadows. The political protection that men like Frank Costello, Tony Accardo, and Meyer Lansky had long relied on was now under direct attack. Kefauver warned that organized crime had corrupted municipal governments in major cities like Los Angeles, New Orleans, and Chicago, citing complaints from mayors who felt powerless to combat such a sophisticated criminal force. With figures like Virgil Peterson of the Chicago Crime Commission laying the groundwork, It was clear that this investigation would reach deep into the heart of the Mafia's operations. Mayor de Lesseps Morrison of New Orleans was among those who voiced concern, warning that Costello was seeking to become both a political dictator and gambling kingpin in America's largest cities. As Kefauver's resolution was approved, the nation braced itself for the Senate inquiry, which promised to drag mob bosses, politicians, and law enforcement into the harsh light of public scrutiny. For men like Lansky and Costello, this was a nightmare come true. The secretive world they had built was now being torn apart in front of the entire nation. The final article in the series, published on January 6, 1950, by Theodore Link, was a foreshadowing of the storm that was about to engulf organized crime. Reporting from Miami Beach, Link described how mobsters across the country were being called to testify before the Senate. The hearings would soon become a public spectacle, with the testimonies broadcast on national television, bringing the Mafia's hidden world into the homes of everyday Americans. The committee hearings, which would soon become infamous, saw mobsters repeatedly invoke the Fifth Amendment, refusing to answer questions for fear of self-incrimination. But the inquiry didn't stop with the gangsters. It extended to the very officials who had enabled their rise. Senators, police chiefs, and public servants were all dragged into the fray, many of them pleading the Fifth themselves. One of the most shocking revelations to come out of these hearings was the scrutiny over the citizenship status of various mobsters. How, the committee asked, had men with such notorious criminal backgrounds managed to stay in the country, some even securing US citizenship? This line of questioning opened a Pandora's box, exposing how these mobsters had lied on their naturalization applications, claiming to be law-abiding citizens while simultaneously building criminal empires. The inquiry revealed a gaping loophole in the immigration system, which had allowed these figures to operate under the guise of legitimacy. This intense focus on the naturalization status of mobsters led to a wave of arrests and revocations. Mobsters who had once operated with impunity were suddenly facing legal battles to maintain their residency, with several facing deportation. By the summer of 1950, even Meyer Lansky, long considered untouchable, was called to testify. This was a defining moment, as Lansky, who had skillfully avoided both public and legal scrutiny for years, was now forced into the spotlight. The final article by Theodore Link was a warning shot, signaling that the 1950s would be a decade of reckoning for organized crime. What had begun as a probe into gambling and racketeering was now transforming into a full-scale war between the US government and the Mafia, threatening to dismantle the power structures that had ruled America's underworld for decades. As the Kefauver Committee's investigation ramped up, the Mafia's golden era came under siege, and the once invincible figures of organized crime would find themselves facing the fight of their lives. This 5-day exposé, and in particular the January 6th article, marked a turning point in American history. It set the stage for the explosive and historic battles that would dominate the headlines in the months and years to come, forever altering the landscape of organized crime in the United States. The mob had thrived in the shadows for years, but now, under the harsh glare of television cameras and Senate inquiries, their reign of secrecy was coming to an end. A payoff of $200,000 a year was offered to Melvin Richard, a Miami Beach city councilman, if he would permit a single group of gamblers to operate punchboards here. He disclosed this to the Post-Dispatch in connection with the newspaper's investigation of crime in the Miami area. Today, there were reports that gambling would reopen tomorrow in Dade County, but Richard's continuing opposition to the gamblers was expected to halt the reopening in Miami Beach. Richard told the Post-Dispatch he rejected the bribe offer, which was made to him by one of his chief backers in the political race. The backer, a businessman not known to be involved in illegal activities, offered Richard what he called a foolproof plan. This man, Richard related, proposed that a group of 4 men be allowed to control punchboards in Miami Beach, Only one of the four was involved in gambling. He had something to do with manufacturing punchboards. The others were businessmen. My caller said the punchboard business would net at least $750,000 a year, but probably more. The way it would work was that the income would be divided into fifths, with 1/5 allotted to me, but without anyone knowing about it. There were 4 provisions for our safety. First, I was not to have anything to do with the business in any manner, shape, or form. My share of the money would reach me in the way he outlined. I would be employed for a fictitious purpose, and the fees that would come to me would ostensibly be for legal work. Second, I was to continue attacking the syndicate and gamblers publicly, but not say anything about this arrangement. Richard estimated that the proposal would have given him about $200,000 a year. He rejected it. The third stipulation was that I should introduce any notable civic improvement bill into the council that I wished, and they would ensure I got enough votes to pass it. This would increase my prestige in the community and give me more power. The fourth stipulation was that I stage dramatic raids on leading bookies or gambling places. The raids would be staged with great fanfare and publicity. My caller said these raids would target big figures in the rackets, not minor operators. I was to accompany the police on each planned raid, and I was to be the central figure, as if it were all my doing. However, once the raid was made and people were taken into custody, I was to drop all interest in the matter. I would not appear as a witness or say anything about the case. The man who made the proposal, Richard said, no longer speaks to him. The latest attempt to soften him up, Richard said, was through a conversation with some friends about the possibility of him being named a United States District Judge. The people who dangled this offer mentioned how difficult it would be to arrange, but they wanted to know if he was interested. He declined. Richard's most recent fight is against Ben Shepherd, the city attorney, who has secretly been performing legal work involving the huge real estate holdings of the S&G Syndicate, the dominant gambling outfit in Miami Beach. Richard has been aided in the city council by Burnett Roth and Mayor Harold Turk. A resolution introduced by the Richard Group, calling for a crackdown on commercialized gambling, was voted down 4-3 in the council. Councilman William Burbridge, Lee Powell, Maurice Klein, and Marcy Lieberman opposed the resolution. Impeachment sought. There was an immediate public demand for the impeachment of the officials because the elected city officers openly supported unlawful gambling operations, but nothing happened. Before his election to the council, Richard led a group of junior Chamber of Commerce members who fought against gamblers and police inefficiency. Racketeers joined the junior chamber in large numbers to defeat the organization's campaign against gambling. Richard recalled how he managed to install a recording device in the house of Ruth Sewell, who operated in Miami Beach during the winter and in the Catskills during the summer. The recordings revealed that Mrs. Sewell claimed to have many Miami Beach policemen on her payroll. The records also showed that she received tip-offs from friendly policemen. Richard's group tested her system and observed policemen driving by her house in advance of raids. As usual in Florida, this uncertain evidence was not pursued further. However, Mrs. Sewell's setup was disrupted to the extent that she had to curtail most of her gambling operations. There is a common saying among the Miami Beach crowd, "You can't get your face slapped on the beach." The reasoning behind this is that gamblers and hoodlums fear having their empire disrupted, so there is an unwritten law against violence. However, one member of the Julie Levitt group of gamblers recently assaulted Milt Sosin, a reporter for the Miami Daily News, out of anger over a story Sosin published. The next day, the S&G Syndicate offered to hire a bodyguard for Sosin and apologized profusely. They even offered to repair his clothes and cover any medical bills. The Crime Commission of Greater Miami has frequently stated that an invisible cloak of protection covers gangland overlords in the Miami area. Led by Colonel Jack Younger, a retired army officer, and driven by the capable Daniel Sullivan, the Commission has been aggressively targeting the criminal activities in the area. The two local newspapers, the Miami Herald and the Daily News, have been equally vigorous in their coverage of gambling and corrupt public officials. However, the laws have been ignored for so long in southern Florida that public officials remain unashamed of their failures, lulled by years of prosecution failures and public apathy. So many gangsters frequent the Grand Hotel that the Crime Commission stated, "There are more hoodlums in one block in the 23rd Street and Collins Avenue area than in any other known place in the country." Among those who frequent the Grand Hotel are Joe Massey, a Detroit racketeer, Benny Street and Dave Glass, Philadelphia policy operators, Charles Fischetti, cousin of Al Capone, Marty Guilfoyle, a Chicago hoodlum, and Jack Greasy Thumb Guzik, a public enemy and one of the chiefs of the Chicago Capone gang. Massey retired to Florida 10 years ago, but he continues to control Detroit's rackets, serving as an advisor and financier. He exercises control through Pete Licavoli, a former St. Louisan who is now a top racketeer in Detroit and Toledo. Licavoli visits Massey frequently in Miami Beach. When Licavoli's mother died in St. Louis last spring, big-time racketeers, including Massey, traveled to St. Louis by airplane from cities all over the country to pay their respects to the Detroit gang leader. Most of the mourners stayed in fashionable West End hotels near Forest Park. In Miami Beach, Massey is regarded by some as a retired businessman who keeps busy by running his provision company. Out-of-town hoodlums from various cities are frequent visitors to his penthouse at the Grand Hotel. They are well aware of his Detroit background, including arrests dating back to 1920 on charges ranging from gambling to suspicion of murder. One of his Detroit associates is Harry Fleischer, who jumped bond after receiving a 25-year sentence for armed robbery in Michigan. Fleischer is now one of the most sought-after men in the United States. Philadelphia is represented in Miami Beach by William Weisberg, also known as Harry Strandberg, a lieutenant in the Nig Rosen gang in the Quaker City. Weisberg and Sam Cappy Hoffman, also a Rosen henchman, were chased out of Philadelphia several times by the police, but they found it easy to become honored guests at beachfront hotels in Miami Beach, until the heat died down. Hoffman has a criminal record in Trenton and Egg Harbor, New Jersey, with charges ranging from gambling to murder. The brothers Michael and Salvatore Polina, who are involved in gambling and vice in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, use a beach hotel as their winter headquarters. Max Siegel, a strong-arm man for the Rosen gang, also winters here. Siegel, who goes by various aliases such as Frank Roy, Shuey Siegel and Big Shuey, has a long criminal record. Other winter resident Samuel Litt, who operates one of Philadelphia's largest handbooks, spends his winters in Miami Beach. Another figure who finds Miami Beach to his liking is John Rosen, also known as Whitey Irvin, who has been arrested 32 times in Philadelphia. Jack Silver, alias Chinky Silver, is known as the enforcer for the Rosen gang and has been the target of almost continuous police investigation in Philadelphia and South Jersey since 1928, except when he is in Miami Beach. Nathan Stromberg, also known as Nussie Rosen and a brother of Nig Rosen, looks after the Miami Beach interests of the Rosen gang. Other frequent visitors include Anthony Narcisi, Harry Proven, a former pickpocket and narcotics dealer, and Jack Newman and his brother Mo, who are sluggers for the Rosen gang. Isaac Halpin, a Miami Beach gambler, is doing better here than he did in Philadelphia, where he was a pickpocket with a record of 54 arrests, according to the records of the Miami Crime Commission. Halpin is now considered a big shot in Miami Beach. Invests in hotels, Isidore Blumenfield, the kingpin racketeer of Minneapolis, has invested $1 million in beachfront hotels. Known as Kid Can and Harry Freeman, Blumenfield has faced charges ranging from bootlegging to murder. Alfred Poggi. Torriello, reputedly the triggerman for the New York Costello mob in New England, owned a share in the largest dice game in the history of American gambling during the 1946-1947 winter season. The game took place at the 115 Club on Biscayne Boulevard and 115th Street, outside of Miami. The club was notorious for the huge sums wagered there, most of which came from black market profits of players who came from across the country. Torriello and his associates hold gambling concessions in the area, as well as interests in casinos in Broward County, just north of Dade County. Torriello often stays at the Wofford Hotel in Miami Beach, but he spends much of his time in a Providence, Rhode Island cafe where New England gang business is conducted. Broward County, located north of Dade County, has about 50 gambling joints operating at full capacity during the peak season when there is no interference from the police or prosecutors. Hollywood, Florida, is the most wide-open place in the county. A veteran police officer told the writer that more hoodlums can be seen on the streets of Hollywood in a single day than in a year in Chicago. Fort Lauderdale, the county seat, is a clean city under the administration of Chief of Police Roland Kelly, a former St. Louisan, but handbooks operate just outside the city limits. Pinball and slot machine operators and numbers of racketeers maintain their headquarters out in the county. Along United States Highway 1, which runs along the east coast of Florida, elaborate gambling joints line the heavily traveled road. Broward County gamblers not only operate in Florida, but also in Cuba and Puerto Rico. One of the largest casinos in Havana is owned by New York gamblers who also control the rackets in Broward County. Control Nevada. 2. The Miami Crime Commission found that the same group of gamblers who control the gambling industry in Florida also decide who can place bets in Nevada, where gambling is legal. New York, Chicago, and Florida, the commission said, control and dictate to Nevada through control of the racing wire service facilities. The pattern seems to be, the commission said, that if the syndicate cannot gain control through business-like methods, they bring about a shutdown of a casino or a bookmaker's operation. Later, the closed-down business reopens, but there is always a new partner involved. This new partner is usually someone from New York, Chicago, or Detroit. The local group has to accept the new partner out of fear of what might happen. Director Sullivan of the Crime Commission stated that Florida seemed proud of its relatively low number of gang-related murders. The murder rate is not as high as it was during the heyday of Chicago, New York, Kansas City, or St. Louis. Sullivan explained that disputes over gambling and illegal operations in Florida are settled in other states to avoid killing the goose that lays the golden eggs of Florida's gambling industry. Meyer Lansky and Jack Lansky, New York hoodlums, operate the pretentious La Boheme Club in Broward County. A group of gangsters associated with the Lanskys also run the Club Green Acres, another large gambling joint in the county. The top law enforcement officer in Broward County is Sheriff Walter Clark, who was once removed from office for lax law enforcement by former Governor Spessard Holland, now a United States Senator. Sheriff Clark told the writer that gambling in the county would soon resume. He pointed to his 17 years in office as proof that the citizens of the county wanted gambling. He also mentioned that he had no connection to the Broward Novelty and Music Company, but that his brother, Chief Deputy Sheriff Robert Clark, had an interest in the company. That company only distributes pinball machines and automatic phonographs, the sheriff said. They don't deal in slot machines. The only slots around here are in private clubs. Besides the Lansky brothers, the New York mob in the area consists of Joe Adonis, also known as Joe Dotto, a Brooklyn racketeer, James Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, Frank Erickson, said to be the largest bookmaker in the country, and William Moretti, also known as Willie Moore. Frank Costello, a leading national gang figure, makes occasional visits to Florida, where he now controls gambling operations. At the dawn of the 1950s, the world of organized crime was undergoing seismic shifts. Only the strongest, toughest, and most ruthless would survive. Every decade brought its own upheaval, but none so cataclysmic as the era ushered in by the 1920s. During that time, Joe Masseria held an iron grip over the underworld, but as the 1930s approached, a new breed of criminals emerged, intent on reshaping the landscape. Enter Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Al Capone. These men, alongside their allies from Jewish, Irish, English, Polish, Welsh, and other communities, built a formidable syndicate. After the bloody fall of Masseria and the swift execution of Salvatore Maranzano, the stage was set for Luciano to reign supreme. Yet Luciano's reign, though powerful, would be short-lived. His imprisonment and eventual exile left a void that could not easily be filled. Decisions were no longer made with the ruthless efficiency they once were. The Justice Department, now emboldened, realized deportation was a potent weapon in their arsenal against these underworld kings. But as the world was thrown into the chaos of the Second World War, the pursuit of these crime lords slowed, giving them time to regroup. In the shadows, they forged new alliances, even infiltrating government agencies, pulling strings from the dark while staying relatively untouchable. But make no mistake, this was no war of guns and bullets. The true architects of crime, the high-ranking Italians and Jewish bosses, rarely saw the inside of a prison cell. It was only the brazen, those who paraded their criminal enterprises too publicly, who took the fall. As these notorious figures were quietly swept away, what emerged was one of the most secretive and elusive crime structures ever known, so hidden, so shadowy, that even law enforcement was left grasping at straws. It was only through events like the 1957 Appalachian meeting that the veil was momentarily lifted, offering a glimpse of this clandestine empire. Much like their Italian counterparts, Jewish mobsters began to feel the heat. Yet one man emerged unscathed from the fire: Meyer Lansky. As others around him, Jewish and Italian alike, crumbled under pressure, Lansky remained a step ahead, untouchable. Mobsters who once ruled with impunity, from the formidable Frank Erickson to lesser-known names, found themselves ensnared in legal battles or imprisoned. Erickson, in particular, was a titan of the gambling world, working closely with Luciano, Joe Adonis, and Frank Costello to spread gambling across the East Coast, from Louisiana to Miami, from New York to Havana. Erickson's influence was so vast that he was present at the historic Atlantic City, Chicago, and Havana conventions, where the underworld's future was mapped out. But even giants fall. By the 1950s, Erickson's empire was crumbling under relentless pressure. Imprisonment and scrutiny devoured the empire he'd built over decades. In the background, it was Lansky who quietly inherited the remnants of Erickson's once mighty operation. As these old-time, public-facing mobsters faded into history, more secretive, calculated bosses like Lansky and the Sicilian Mafia rose to dominate the scene. Erickson's fall, detailed in two gripping articles from June 1950, marked not just the decline of one of America's richest gambling moguls, but the rise of an even more formidable, shadowy empire. The June 1950 articles capture Erickson's downfall, laying bare the relentless forces that crushed him, forces that would leave Lansky and his associates to reign supreme over a more secretive yet more powerful underworld. District Attorney Hogan yesterday unveiled his strategy for putting gambler Frank Erickson out of business. The grand jury filed a 60-count criminal charge, with 1 conspiracy and 59 bookmaking counts, seemingly placing America's rotund bookie boss in the worst situation yet. If Erickson pleads guilty, he faces potentially staggering consequences. Theoretically, 1 year in prison, a $500 fine, or both for each count, a total of 60 years and/or $30,000. If Erickson fights the charges, he may force the district attorney to reveal the identities of many of the bookie's most valued clients. 30 to 40 of these clients have already testified before the grand jury, their names kept confidential. If the case goes to trial, Hogan may call this entire group as witnesses. Erickson values his high-stakes bettors, a fact made clear in the official records released yesterday. In 1948, he visited Tiffany's and purchased 1,000 gold, monogrammed tie clasps at a cost of $29,000 as Christmas gifts for his top clients. The following year, he distributed gift certificates for 124 hats, worth $20 to $25 each, totaling $2,157.60. The list of Erickson's bettors, whose names could be exposed, may even reach the hundreds. Hogan noted, "The list of initials provided to Tiffany's for the monogramming corresponds to Erickson's bettors. This suggests that, among the records seized from Erickson's Park Avenue office, a complete list of bettors may have been discovered." Forewarned that the grand jury's charges were imminent, Erickson appeared with his attorney at the district attorney's office yesterday and surrendered. With an unusually solemn expression on his round pink face, he was booked, arraigned, and held on $10,000 bail. Hogan disclosed that the 59 bookmaking counts covered bets totaling $86,788.35, commenting, "There could have been 10,000 counts." Hogan further stated, "There is no doubt that this defendant is the biggest and most notorious bookmaker in the United States. For over 20 years, he has regularly, consistently, and daily broken the laws of this state and every other state in the country." Nevertheless, Hogan did not request more than $10,000 bail, adding, "I am certain that Erickson will not flee from the tremendous fortune he has accumulated through illegal activities." Justice Nathan Perlman set the $10,000 bail with the agreement of Erickson's attorney, Sol Gelb. Hogan pushed for an early trial date, suggesting next Monday, but Gelb requested more time. Justice Perlman directed both parties to return on June 12th, when a trial date would be set. Gelb emphasized Erickson's social standing, stating, "There is no doubt that bookmaking is a misdemeanor, but there is also no doubt that it is not a crime involving moral turpitude. The legislature has declared as much. Many people have become fabulously wealthy through bookmaking at the racetracks." Erickson, who gave his age as 54, listed his business address as 487 Park Avenue and his home address as 610 West End Avenue. He described himself as a US-born real estate operator. Observers noted that his equally famous associate, Frank Costello, also identifies himself as a real estate man. The 59 betting counts span offences between June 8, 1948, when a $400 horse bet was placed, and April 26th of this year, when the largest bet, $15,000, was recorded. The conspiracy charge is not limited to horse racing. It includes baseball, basketball, and other contests of skill, speed, and power involving men and animals. The counts included 51 bets on horse racing, 5 on basketball games, and 3 on baseball games. According to Hogan, these bets were discovered through records seized on May 1st, when the district attorney's office confiscated cancelled checks and other documents from Erickson's Richards dummy account at the Pennsylvania Exchange Bank. The account was maintained by Erickson's employee, Harry Richards, who has been held on $100,000. Bail since May 4th as a material witness. Richards is the only person named as a co-conspirator in the case, though he was not charged. He has been cooperating with investigators. Hogan stated that the investigation began in April 1948 as a result of information obtained from the Alvin Paris attempted football fix. The probe proceeded quietly until Erickson's recent appearance before the Senate committee in Washington. There, the rotund bookie openly admitted to his large-scale gambling operations and claimed that his personal earnings amounted to $100,000 a year. Fearing that Erickson's records might be removed or destroyed, Hogan swiftly seized all relevant documents from Erickson's Park Avenue office. Hogan admitted that he found far more than expected. Some of the bets listed by the grand jury were handled personally by Erickson, who occasionally dined with his preferred clients. In other instances, collectors handled the transactions. The charges against Erickson also cover activities in New York, New Jersey, and other states. Erickson, Richards, and unnamed individuals are accused of conspiring to commit acts injurious to public morals, pervert and obstruct the administration of the law, and violate Section 986 of the Penal Law, which relates to bookmaking. When asked whether he intended to target Frank Costello next, Hogan mentioned that he had already subpoenaed Joe Adonis's financial records in New Jersey. Adonis, referred to as Joe A. in underworld circles, was revealed in Erickson's papers as one of the bookmaker's partners in the Colonial Inn, a well-known gambling resort north of Miami. This suggests that Hogan may also seek financial records from other partners in the Colonial Inn, including Vincent, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Alo, Meyer and Jack Lansky, Mert Wertheimer, Bert Briggs, George Sadlow, Eben Matthews, S.L. Bratt, and Richard Melvin, if those records are within his jurisdiction. One of Hogan's subpoenas, served Monday in New Jersey, was directed at George Goldstein, a Newark accountant who prepared tax returns related to the Colonial Inn. After the commotion surrounding Erickson subsided, Senator Estes Kefauver, Democrat of Tennessee, and chairman of the Senate subcommittee investigating organized crime, met with Hogan for the first time. Kefauver, accompanied by former U.S. Assistant Attorney Boris Kostelanets, spent an hour with Hogan and Assistant District Attorneys Alfred Scotty and Vincent O'Connor, discussing plans for further cooperation. Kefauver told reporters that he expects to meet with Hogan many more times in the coming months. This article was a scathing critique not just of Luciano's empire, but also of Lansky's associates, including notorious figures like Jimmy Blue Eyes Arlo and his brother Jake Lansky. Their gambling operations were titanic, generating hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet despite this success, Lansky and the larger world of organized crime faced a critical challenge: what to do with all the money they were raking in. The answer? Swiss bank accounts in Switzerland and a sophisticated network of hidden rackets to funnel and launder their cash. These men were masters of reinvestment. After paying off their armies of henchmen, crooked politicians, and skimming their own profits, whatever was left was funneled into new ventures. It was a self-perpetuating empire, untouchable, expanding, and untraceable. A $100 million take in one racket would be reinvested in another, fueling an endless cycle of growth. The empire, built on vice, thrived in the shadows. Yet in the world of organized crime, no reign lasted forever. Most bosses, even the smartest and most ruthless, could only expect 8 to 10 years at the top before their power crumbled. Frank Erickson had had a long run, but his time was coming to an end. As his empire fell, his business and political connections were handed over to the Sicilians and Lansky, who were rapidly becoming the new powerhouses in organized crime. Contrary to weakening them, the purges of the 1950s strengthened these crime syndicates, weeding out the careless and leaving only the cunning to thrive. What the media and law enforcement of the time failed to understand was that this wasn't just organized crime, it was a parallel government. The article barely scratched the surface of the Jewish and Sicilian Mafia connection, missing the larger picture entirely. There was no mention of how a nationwide syndicate had emerged, a shadow state operating alongside the US government. The authorities were blind to the fact that the Sicilian Mafia had played a crucial role in the invasion of Sicily during World War II, working hand in hand with the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. They were oblivious to the deep corruption that had infiltrated institutions like the FBI, where even the infamous J. Edgar Hoover was compromised, or the IRS, which was being used to dismantle rival mobsters who posed a threat to the Syndicate's power. Even the senators and politicians who were grilling these mobsters in hearings weren't innocent. Many had been corrupted by the very men they were supposed to bring to justice. Some historians suggest that the crusade against figures like Marcello, Costello, Mo Dalitz, Erickson, Castell and Lansky wasn't solely about crime control. It was about a deeper fear. Politicians, especially Protestants, were increasingly worried about the growing influence of Catholic, Irish, Jewish and Italian communities in American politics, fearing they would bring with them new layers of corruption, a new voting bloc, and a shift in power. The battle wasn't just about organized crime, it was another chapter in the long-standing tension between Protestants, the Jewish community, and Catholics. And the battleground? Gambling, vice, political corruption, and the underworld that fueled it. In the end, the crackdown on mobsters like Erickson and the Jewish-Italian Syndicate did not weaken the Mafia. It only sharpened its focus, consolidating power among those who knew how to thrive in secrecy. The public face of organized crime might have changed, but beneath the surface, it was more entrenched and more dangerous than ever. By the end of June 1950, Frank Erickson's once mighty empire was unraveling. His imprisonment marked the beginning of the end for the old guard, as a younger, hungrier, and more ruthless generation of mobsters prepared to seize control. These younger men were led by figures like Carlos Marcello, Vito Genovese, Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo, and Giancana, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Russell Bufalino, Angelo Bruno, Jake Lansky, Trafficante Jr., Joe Zerilli, the Campisi family, and Joe Civello, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Colombo, Mickey Cohen, and Meyer Lansky were primed to take it all over, creating a billion-dollar monopoly on everything from gambling to transportation. They were reshaping the underworld into an even more secretive and dangerous entity. This article captures that pivotal moment in the history of organized crime, showcasing the constant evolution and cutthroat nature of a world where only a few would live to see old age. Erickson and his contemporaries once believed they were untouchable, but as time passed, it became clear that decline was inevitable. For many, prison was the best-case scenario. Most would be violently eliminated, making way for those waiting in the wings. Erickson's close associates, including Willie Moretti, Albert Anastasia, Longy Zwillman, Frank Scalise, the Mangano brothers, and Frank Costello, became targets in a deadly power struggle. Even his longtime friend Charlie Luciano, exiled to Italy, was marked for death by a hit team sent by Vito Genovese. No one was safe. The 1950s became a decade of decline for these old-timers who ruled supreme during the Prohibition era. The underworld they had built was now turning on them, devouring its own to ensure survival. Only the most cunning and ruthless would escape the bloody purges that marked this era. But survival in the 1950s was just the beginning. The 1960s loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon, promising an all-out war against organized crime, led by none other than Robert F. Kennedy. If the 1950s were warning shots, the 1960s would be a full-scale assault on the Syndicate, testing whether the new and old generation of mobsters could outlast the relentless onslaught of law enforcement. For Erickson and his peers, the 1950s were a bitter end to decades of dominance. They had built empires and thought themselves invincible, but by the end of the decade, most were either imprisoned, exiled, or dead. Only a select few, those willing to adapt and play a deeper game, would live to see the brutal years ahead. The golden era of mobsters like Erickson was over, and a new, more brutal chapter was beginning. Frank Erickson's life, from hustling bets as a young punk on Stratton's Wharf in Coney Island in his 20s, to becoming a banker for bookmakers, was described in detail yesterday by District Attorney Hogan. Erickson's rise to prominence as the top bookmaker in the nation was highlighted in a report to the Special Sessions Probation Department. Hogan stated that Erickson first moved to Manhattan around 1922 after spending 2 or 3 years booking bets in Brooklyn. As far back as the late 1920s, Erickson employed 5 men on his staff, and by the boom year of 1929, he had a payroll of more than a dozen employees and had established a wire room in New Jersey. Even at this early stage of his career, Hogan said, he had customers in many parts of the nation. At the height of his operations, just before the district attorney intervened, Erickson's staff numbered about 25, including wire room clerks based in New Jersey. Erickson was entitled to 5 days off his sentence monthly for good behavior, which would reduce his sentence by 120 days to 20 months. However, the Department of Correction clarified that the good behavior reward was actually 10 days per month, amounting to 240 days, reducing his total jail time to 16 months. Justice Nathan Pearlman presided over the sentencing, with Justices Frank Oliver and John V. Flood also in attendance. Justice Flood replaced Justice Joseph V. Loscalzo, who withdrew for unspecified personal reasons. Saul Gelb, Erickson's attorney, had not yet decided whether to appeal, citing the excessiveness of the sentence. Gelb questioned whether a person could be sentenced to 2 consecutive 1-year terms for a misdemeanor. District Attorney Hogan appeared satisfied with the sentence. Erickson was held overnight in the Criminal Courts building and was scheduled to be transported to Rikers Island at 9 o'clock in the morning. Erickson, dressed in a dark grey, single-breasted tropical worsted suit, white shirt, and a conservative black and white tie, appeared in court at 9:55 in the morning. He remained silent before and after the sentence. While he showed no emotion, except for twiddling his thumbs, he did briefly nod at Hogan when their eyes met. Gelb argued that the public's weakness for gambling is what fosters bookmaking, much like the failure of Prohibition enforcement. He characterized Erickson's prosecution as a manifestation of vengeance and questioned, "Are we looking for a sacrificial offering to ease the public for its vices?" Gelb emphasized that Erickson, a native New Yorker, had never been anything but a gambler and had not corrupted public officials. Erickson, Gelb noted, had instructed those called to testify to tell the truth and not to try to aid him. Gelb urged the court not to be swayed by the mood of the times, but to impose a sentence within the bounds of the law. He added, "If that is done, the defendant can't complain." He noted that there had previously been a passive understanding about enforcing the bookmaking law, which had fallen into a state of disuse. Treating Erickson as a criminal of moral turpitude, Gelb argued, would be wrong, cruel, and vengeful. Hogan dismissed Gelb's sociological arguments and reminded the court that Erickson had pleaded guilty to 60 crimes and could have been charged with hundreds more. Hogan explained that the charges were not selected arbitrarily. Enough witnesses were called to warrant a grand jury indictment representative of the scope of Erickson's operations. Experience tells us that gambling brings nothing but crime, poverty, and corruption, whether legal or illegal, Hogan said. Erickson, he emphasized, had operated as a master mechanic in what has been described as the nation's largest racket. Hogan noted Erickson's long-standing associations with notorious underworld figures, including Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky, and the Detroit Purple Gang. He has been singularly adroit in evading the law, Hogan asserted. Erickson, Hogan claimed, knows all the tricks and, in fact, invented most of them. He is allergic to heat in any form. Hogan further rejected the notion of Erickson being called a gambler, stating, "Gambler is a misnomer. He took no chances. He always had a sure thing, and all he needed was an opportunity to break the law." Despite being arrested 10 times, Erickson had never spent a day in jail. While Frank Erickson was being sentenced in special sessions, a smaller-time gambler faced his own consequences one floor below, in Gambler's Court. Thomas Monroe, age 45, of 483 St. Nicholas Avenue, was caught with a single policy slip. He received 6 months in jail and was fined $500. History, as they say, has a way of repeating itself, and nowhere is this more evident than in the tangled web of political corruption and organized crime. This next article in our series delves into the raw power of the mob and the systemic corruption that kept their grip tight on American society. The reason I started this channel was to expose the deep links between organized crime and political corruption, a relationship that stretches back to the Prohibition era, a time when America's streets were flooded with bootleg liquor and backroom deals. This era didn't just change America's nightlife. It changed how business was done, how elections were won, and how power was brokered. Politicians, for the first time in modern history, were handed easy money. It became the grease that turned the wheels of power. The elites, entrenched in their wealth, and street-level gangsters, fattened by their illegal rackets, found mutual benefit in working together. The politicians sought to maintain their control and riches, while the gangsters sought protection for their growing empires. Figures like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky understood that controlling politics was the key to controlling America. They didn't just make millions off of gambling, drugs, and vice. They helped create political dynasties, shaping the outcome of elections, and through the unions, they could turn obscure politicians into powerful figures seemingly overnight. The Mafia's relationship with the working class was intimate and shrewd. These mobsters, in many cases, had a better pulse on the thoughts and feelings of everyday Americans than the politicians themselves. Today, politicians rely on polls to tell them what the people think. But back then, the Mafia gathered its own information from the streets, giving them unparalleled insight into what the public wanted. Money was central to this operation. Luciano, Costello, and Lansky made no secret that much of the wealth they accumulated during Prohibition and through the 1930s and 40s was poured back into political corruption. As Luciano famously admitted, they paid off the police, senators, judges, and public officials before they paid themselves. What they did next was unprecedented. They pushed hundreds of thousands of dollars into the hands of politicians who, up until then, were only used to receiving modest bribes of a few $100 or $1,000. This influx of cash created a new wave of political corruption. For the first time, organized crime had become more than just a criminal underworld. They were power brokers shaping the future of America. Even Franklin D. Roosevelt wasn't above tapping into this corrupt network when he needed to. He used the Mafia's influence to spread his message, raise funds, and gain public support in his campaign. Billboards, newspapers, and other forms of mass media were funded by the mob to help push Roosevelt into office. But once FDR secured his position in the White House, he turned on the very people who had helped him. He led a crusade against Luciano, Costello, and others, showing the precariousness of political alliances. As we move into the 1950s, where this documentary is focused, the investigations into organized crime were heating up, and political corruption was in the spotlight. What we see today, dark money, lobbying, and massive campaign contributions, wasn't the norm in those days. But make no mistake, corruption was rampant. It's just that America, still in its isolationist phase, hadn't yet fully embraced the global political stage. The corrupt politicians of the time were mainly operating within the borders, enriching themselves and their cities or states. But as America began its rise to global power, the influx of money into politics became staggering, and it started to spiral out of control. The Italian-American Mafia were pioneers of this type of political manipulation. In New York, figures like Costello and Luciano held sway, while in Chicago, Al Capone and Jake Guzik built empires. In the South, Carlos Marcello controlled Louisiana and much of the Gulf Coast. These mafia figures didn't just control the streets, they controlled politicians, police chiefs, and worked with military generals. And as the mafia's power expanded, so too did their influence over American life. Fast forward to the 1970s, when politicians in Texas and other states were accepting campaign contributions from drug money, and we see the mafia's model of corruption expanding. Political families were built with dirty money, and no one batted an eye. The articles from this time were rife with stories of political corruption, a sinister group of men controlling politicians which would later be referred to as the Mafia. But it's nothing compared to what we face today. Back then, the press exposed these men because they were Mafia men, dragging their names through the mud. The press, while often viewed as the ultimate watchdog in the fight against organized crime, was not without its own entanglements in corruption and influence. Many of the Mafia men, particularly those with interests in racing wires and gambling operations, had strategic alliances with rival newspapers and media moguls. These alliances weren't just about protection. They were about power and influence over the public narrative. Behind the scenes, these mobsters were weaving a web of connections with Hollywood studios and media empires, crafting a vast influence in the entertainment industry. Some newspapers and their owners were relentless in going after these gangsters, but the motivations were often more complex than simply seeking justice. These newspapers were owned by powerful families who had their own political and financial agendas. Many were aligned with the very political elites and rival criminal factions that were shaping the future of America. The press, far from being an impartial observer, was itself a battleground where old money, political families, and criminal organizations vied for control of the public narrative. These newspaper empires weren't just about reporting the news. They controlled ink and paper supplies, distribution networks, and even the studios that shaped public perception through films. Hollywood was a key component of this battle for influence. The Mafia's interests in the racing wires and gambling gave them significant leverage over the media industries, and their infiltration into Hollywood provided them with a powerful tool to control how they and their rivals were portrayed. It's no coincidence that some gangsters appeared to be media darlings, while others were relentlessly pursued and vilified. The powerful families who owned these newspapers had their own alliances, often with political figures or even more sinister networks. These families were deeply entrenched in America's power structure, controlling not just the press, but banking, politics, and industry. The Mafia may have controlled the streets, but these families controlled the nation's narratives. They were the gatekeepers of information, determining which stories would be told and which would be buried. Their interests aligned with those of political dynasties, creating a complex system of mutual protection and influence. This shadowy dance between the press, the political elite, and organized crime played a significant role in shaping American society. While the Mafia was often in the headlines, being cast as the villains of the era, many of the families who owned and operated the media were just as invested in maintaining control over American life. The real fight wasn't just about taking down mobsters. It was about ensuring that those in power, whether in politics, business, or the media, remained untouchable. The Mafia's influence in Hollywood and the press only added to their ability to manipulate public perception. They weren't just gangsters, they were becoming cultural figures, sometimes glorified, sometimes vilified, but always maintaining a presence in the national consciousness. The newspapers that targeted them did so not only to expose their criminal activities, but often because they were involved in their own rivalries for control of the media and political landscape. This deeper level of corruption and influence between the Mafia, the press, and political power underscores the intricate and far-reaching networks that shaped mid-20th century America. The public saw gangsters being taken down, But what they didn't see were the powerful alliances and rivalries that lurked beneath the surface, where the real control of America was being fought over. Not just in the streets, but in the headlines, boardrooms and studios. Today, the press is controlled by a new elite, one that learned from history and ensures that the true power brokers remain in the shadows. What took down the Mafia wasn't law enforcement. It was the press. Once Luciano, Costello and others became household names, their anonymity was shattered and their empires began to crumble. Today's ruling class, however, remains hidden, controlling everything from the media to the military-industrial complex. The Mafia may no longer hold the same power, but their lessons have been absorbed by a new kind of Mafia, one that knows how to control the world without ever stepping into the spotlight. This article, which blared the headlines, reading, "Florida Gambling, Probed while Gillette Committee, Soft Pedals, Big Campaign Contributors," looks into these themes in depth, linking the past with the present, to show that political corruption, dark money, and lobbying have only grown more sophisticated and more dangerous over time. The headline was followed up with, "Kefauver investigators will find racketeers buying politicians in huge Pennsylvania campaign with gifts manages to escape inspection." What we see today is the evolution of a system that Luciano, Costello, Jake Guzik, Carlos Marcello, Joe Zerilli and others helped to create. They may be gone, but their legacy of political manipulation lives on, thriving in the hands of those who now control America's destiny. Two Democratic senators from different regions appear to have widely differing views on large campaign contributions. Number one is the serious-minded Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, who on Thursday launched a significant investigation into Florida gambling, including the third of $1 million funneled into the political campaign of Fuller Warren to elect him governor of Florida. Warren is a Democrat, as is Kefauver, but the senator isn't letting that fact interfere with the investigation. Number two is the amiable silver-haired Senator Guy Gillette of Iowa, chairman of a Senate committee supposedly investigating large campaign contributions. When Gillette was asked too many questions about the contributions, he simply tipped his hat and walked away. This year, more money has been funneled into senatorial primaries than almost any other year in history, by both Democrats and Republicans. However, Gillette does not seem keen on embarrassing either party. Down in Miami, Senator Kefauver's investigation will delve into how gambling rackets have become intertwined with political rackets. Though I haven't spoken to Kefauver's investigators, I have studied Florida gambling and can provide a general overview of what they will likely uncover. Gambling in Florida's lavish winter sporting venues is divided among three major groups. Number one is the old Capone mob, led by William Johnston of Chicago and Jacksonville, controls dog racing throughout the state. The second is the S&G Syndicate, a group of local businessmen, controls bookmaking in Miami and Miami Beach. The third is the New York mob, under Meyer Lansky, an associate of Frank Costello, operates in Broward County, north of Miami Beach. To protect the millions in profits generated from these operations, these groups bribe local sheriffs and even the governor of Florida. For instance, when the Chicago gang told the S&G Syndicate to share the Miami bookmaking racket, the S&G Syndicate appealed to the man it had helped elect to office, Dade County Sheriff Jimmy Sullivan. When the Chicago gang faced resistance from the S&G Syndicate, it turned to the man it had helped elect as governor, Fuller Warren. Dog racer William Johnston contributed an astounding $154,000 to Warren's primary campaign, despite the fact that state law at the time limited contributions to $5,000 per person. After Warren was elected, he changed the law. Another $154,000 was given and loaned to Warren by Louis Wolfson of Jacksonville, again in violation of the $5,000 limit. Now, Governor Warren finds himself caught in the middle of a gambling war, and the Kefauver Crime Committee is keen to discover what the gamblers received in return for their massive campaign contributions. Meanwhile, in the good old Republican state of Pennsylvania, other large campaign contributions have been revealed. This time, it's not gamblers, but big manufacturers making the contributions. Joe Grundy, the famed GOP high-tariff advocate, donated $94,000 to the J. Cook John Kunkel campaign in Pennsylvania to defeat Governor Jim Duff, also a Republican. Mason Owlett contributed $52,000 and loaned another $45,000, while his wife gave $3,000. W.T. Wright also loaned $156,135 to the Kunkel-Cook Committee. However, in Washington, Senator Gillette did not seem particularly interested in these large contributions. He sent Fielding Wright, Jr., son of the Mississippi Dixiecrat governor, to Pennsylvania to investigate the substantial funds provided by the manufacturers. It was later revealed that Wright mainly paid a social call on the Pennsylvania Secretary of State. When asked about Wright's activities in Pennsylvania, Gillette admitted he didn't know. "Aren't you the chairman?" the senator was asked. "Of course, but I don't keep track of every detail," said Gillette, reaching for his hat. When reminded that Wright had merely picked up information available in the Secretary of State's office, information anyone could obtain by writing a letter, Gillette insisted, "No, he got more information than that." When asked about Wright's qualifications as an investigator, Gillette responded, "I don't know." Pressed further about whether he had reviewed Wright's qualifications before hiring him, Gillette, again reaching for his hat, replied, "Sure." But when asked how much investigative experience Wright had, Gillette avoided the question altogether. "I'm just not going to give you that information," he said. "Isn't it true that Wright spends most of his time in the office of Senator Stennis of Mississippi, rather than out in the field investigating campaign expenditures?" The reporter persisted. This time, Gillette not only grabbed his hat, but quickly ducked through the door and walked briskly down the Senate office building corridor. "The senator," explained his assistant, "has to meet some Boy Scouts." That perhaps explains the type of handshaking that likable Guy Gillette prefers at a time when as much as $1.5 million has been spent in a single primary to elect a man to a position paying only $12,500. Maybe Gillette thinks meeting Boy Scouts is more important, but when the voters wake up to what's going on, they probably won't agree.